Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone, and welcome back to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode, we are killing it with more of our A+ series, our 22901, that is, if you're paying attention. And joining us in the studio to help us pay attention, our good friend, Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, glad to have you again, man.
Man,
How's it
you
going?
are throwing a lot on me to pay attention. That's right.
Yeah,
So
true.
broke, I can't even pay attention. That's right, guys. Welcome back, and we are continuing along, just like Dan said, in our A+ series, and we're really focused in on that first certification exam. And we're going to be continuing through, if you are, like Dan said, following along with us, you've probably seen that we've been spending a lot of time in hardware, right? Well, the first exam really has to do a lot with the hardware itself. Doesn't mean you're not going to see the operating system, but for the most part, we're going to be looking at those components that overall make up our computing experience. And what we're going to be diving in today is how we really see what's going on, in the computing experience, and that's going to be display devices. There are many different types of displays out there, all different kinds of manufacturers, if you will, and the technology has definitely changed throughout the years, and we have to be aware of some of these components if you are going to sit that exam. So one of the first ones that we're going to talk about, I am glad to see, is no longer on the exam anymore, and that's something known as the old cathode ray tube, right? These cathode ray tubes, also called CRT monitors, these are the big monitors that were very, very heavy, weren't very, didn't have they weren't space savers, if you will. Thank goodness today, because they're kind of an older technology, a really old technology, they have ceased to be on our exam. But we just kind of wanted to mention them here just briefly, and so that you understand that at a certain point we moved into a couple of types. And the types that are on the exam are going to be what is known as the LCD screen and the LED screen. Dan, I don't even think I can get 5 minutes into any episode with an A+ without a little bit of acronym and alphabet soup.
Yeah, they definitely love the acronyms in our line of biz. So if you don't like it, that's a really hard, tough thing to swallow because you're going to have to get used to it.
Yeah, and that's Dan's way of saying tough. That's right. So guys, and again, just keep in mind, learning a new lingo, just like any profession that you might be, striving to get in. So these acronyms will become yesterday's news once you start to acclimate yourself to them. So what do we mean when we say LCD? But what we're talking about is something known as a liquid crystal display. All right, and when we talk about LEDs, we're talking about light-emitting diodes, right? Light-emitting diodes, you've probably seen them before. In fact, they're kind of popular today in flashlights. I know Dan and I were talking about like the old mag lights, right? Real bright light today, but they're really moving, away from a traditional bulb into these really ultra-bright LEDs. Well, that forms really the basis for the LED monitors and how they're lit today. Now, when we talk about LCD screen, a liquid crystal display, I want you to know that there are certain components within it that you kind of want to be aware of. In fact, I've got a little bit of a diagram here, and what you have with liquid crystal displays is you have a series of layers, right? Now, I don't think that every individual layer by any means is going to be on the exam, but it is kind of good to know. There will be a couple of things that we want to be aware of. Like, for instance, when you look at these LCDs and LED screens, for that matter, they have what's known as an anti-reflective layer on the top. And I want to take a second and just talk about that anti-reflective layer, because we've got to be really, really careful on how you clean the surface of an LCD or an LED screen, because that anti-reflective layer, it can actually get damaged. So you want to make sure that you're using things like lint-free cloths, if you will. They have pre-moistened wipes that are out there. Microfibers are very, very popular today. Really, really good way to clean these off. But keep in mind, be very, very careful. Now, as you go through the different layers, you can see a polarizing layer, you can see a glass layer, color filters, if you will, liquid crystal layer as well. And when we get down to these two layers, and it's actually both in LEDs and LCDs, and we'll talk about really what the difference is between these two types here coming up in a second, you'll see TFT layer. There we go with the acronyms again. What does that mean? Well, that's actually something known as a thin film transistor, and it is something that's specific to LCDs and LED screens. And what it means is that every single pixel that you see within that screen has a transistor that's related to it. So you get a much better picture than you did in the earlier days, especially with the earlier CRT monitors. Now, with an LCD screen, the other thing that I want you to know is that, yes, we have a glass layer, another polarizing layer, so kind of sandwiching on itself, really. And one of the last ones we have, very, very important. Now, on the exam, they call out what is known as fluorescent, just basically, they just say fluorescent. They don't say anything else. Well, what does that mean, right? Well,
Really helpful and descriptive, isn't it?
It really is, right? So let's see if we can help you with what fluorescent means, excuse me, if I can even say it. More specifically, it's something known as a CCFL. Again, CCFL is something known as a cold cathode fluorescent lamp. Now, that's how an LCD screen is lit. Now, you might say, well, Wes, what the heck is that? Dan, what are we talking about? Well, I want you to look, if you've ever seen the glass fluorescent bulbs that are in buildings and stuff, the concept is absolutely the same, just more on a micro scale, right? We're not talking about like the 19-inch fluorescent lamp. We're talking about very, very small. And that is something that is common to the LCDs. And the LCDs they're still used today, but pretty much very popular up to about 2010. And with the cold cathode fluorescent lamps, they're either placed on the opposite ends to provide the lighting, or you can have an entire array of them in the back, right? That's the difference between what they call side lighting and what they call backlighting, right? So if they're backlit, then what you have is a series of, almost looks like ladders. If you were to strip off all these layers and you were looking at the bulbs, it would look like two series of ladders, right? Almost like you could climb up them. And it's just little strips of fluorescent lamps. Now, that's something to keep in mind. Now, there's something about fluorescent backlighting, if you will, with the LCD screens is that it requires more power. See, fluorescent bulbs, if you're not aware of them, they have a balustrade right on the back of them, and it provides the electricity to essentially light the lamp itself. That's why sometimes when you see that the light starts to dim, that might not necessarily be the fact that it's the bulb that's failing. It could be the balustrade, that the electrical component that connects to it. Well, that takes a lot of power, right? And that is one of the drawbacks to the LCD screens, is that they are really, really power hungry. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with an LCD-based screen is that not only do they require more power, but they're also thicker, right? If you've gone into any one of your electronic stores today, doesn't matter, stop by Best Buy, Walmart, or any of them out there, you might notice that we have ultra-thin TVs, televisions, and monitors today, right? Well, that typically isn't going to be an LCD screen just because of the fact that we got those fluorescent bulbs that are inside of the LCD screen. Now, so not only are they a little bit thicker and a little bit bulkier, one of the things to keep in mind too is that they have a shorter lifespan, right? Because just like any device, right, you think about a flashlight, right? And again, it's more prevalent to see even LEDs today. But if you think about a flashlight that had the bulbs, right, the bulbs could go bad. Right. Well, it's really no different than the LCD monitor. So the lifetime of the monitor is a little bit shorter. Now, I know probably what some of you are saying, Dan, and I have to keep this in the back of my head too, is that I've had a monitor now for 10 years. It's LCD. So you're saying, well, wait a second, a shorter lifespan. Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of like a crapshoot. Yeah, exactly. As opposed to, like, I don't know, the lifetime of the Earth. I'm not sure. But again, keep in mind that when we talk about the CCFL or the LCD-based screen, more power, a little bit more bulkier, and as well, shorter lifetime. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, I want you to think about when you reach over and, right, and you turn a fluorescent bulb on, right? Maybe you're in your kitchen, right, and you flip the light on. Some of you out there might notice that the light comes on maybe right away. How many of you have ever seen where it takes a little bit for the light to come on? That's the other thing about an LCD light compared to the the LED screens, right? They have a higher latency. Latency or delay, or like I say, delatency, is just basically the fact that, let's say you're in a game, right? You're the gamer, right? If the gamer, you're probably building your machine, but you've bought a gaming system, right? You don't want to spend a lot of money on your gaming system only to get less frames per second. We'll talk about frame rate here coming up, right? But you want to get as much speed out of it as you can. So LCD screens, again, maybe relative to the human eye, you don't see the latency, but you can certainly see it when you're talking about milliseconds and then nanoseconds, which is really what our computer components are measured in, right? Storage devices are measured in milliseconds. Things like your RAM and your CPU are measured in nanoseconds. And when you spend the extra money to get better performance out of your machine, you could be doing yourself some injustice by using one of the LCD screens. Now, at the time, popular, if you will, very, very popular, is the replacement of the old CRTs when we moved into LCDs, right? But now we have what are known as LEDs. Oh, and you know what? Let me go ahead. Yeah, let me talk about another thing too that also is common with LCDs and LEDs, and that's a couple of terms known as TN and IPS. All right, so what do we mean? Well, when I say IPS, I'm not talking about like something that's in beer. That's IPUs, right? And we talk about IPS.
Intrusion protection, right?
Very good.
Yeah.
I never even draw a fact. That's right. You don't have an intrusion protection system on your monitor, but we'll talk about the older technology first. The twisted pneumatic. That's what TN stands for. And I certainly don't think they should get that specific on the exam, but just know TN is a monitor, a display-related technology. And there's something about it. It's one of the most common. It's also one of the most oldest implementations. It has very short response times, right? So lower latency. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that twisted pneumatic-based screens also have a higher brightness, and we're going to talk about brightness and lumens because that gets a little tricky on what they actually mean there. It has a less power draw, so again, lower power, very, very good, if you will, for gaming. Here's the drawback, right? We always talk about this, Dan. We say, okay, yeah, well, if it's good, there's got to be a bad in there somewhere, right? You know, and that's the viewing angle. Now, it's not as bad as the earlier passive matrix screens that you had to sit right on laptops and stuff, that you had to sit right in front of it to be able to see it, but the viewing angle isn't as great. So if I was to move to the side here and then move to the other side, you end up seeing that the screen kind of dims out. So that is one of the drawbacks to the twisted pneumatic. Now, they have the IPS, right? And unlike, we kind of joked around, it doesn't mean intrusion prevention system. What it means is in-plane switching. Now, with in-plane switching, again, this has better color. Twisted pneumatic, and I might want to mention that too. A twisted pneumatic doesn't have the bright, very vibrant colors of the newer IPS-based machines. And guess what? It also has a better viewing angle, right? And that's the great thing, is that being to one side of the monitor doesn't really hinder the overall viewing experience. The last thing I want you to keep in mind about in-plane switching is it has lower contrast ratios, which is a good thing. When you talk about a contrast ratio, that's a ratio between the brightest color you see and the darkest color you see. So please do keep that in mind. And you know what? Actually, I got that backwards. Let me restate that. Higher contrast ratio is better. I don't know why I mentioned it that way. Higher contrast ratio. Again, better color, if you will. We're talking about that ratio between the highest or the brightest color and the darkest color. So those are some of the things that you can see inside of, for instance, things like LCDs and LED screens. Okay, let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about, well, the LED for a bit. All right, now the LED is pretty much the same exact technology. In fact, I'll let you guys kind of look at the diagram that I have here, and by all means, you can always pause it and you can kind of go through these layers, right? Notice the one thing that changes, and I can make it a lot easier for you guys to see it. It's the bottom row, right? It's how it's backlit that really changes everything. LEDs, imagine. What do you think it's backlit with? A light emitting diode. That's one of the reasons we call them LEDs.
Yeah, but they get super bright, and they're a whole lot easier to like work with, right? They also take up less energy.
Yes.
So you'll notice that like LCDs are typically thinner, they're lighter, and are more energy efficient.
Most definitely. I couldn't say it better myself. That's exactly what it is. It comes down to a smaller form factor, the fact that you look at the side of the monitor and also almost disappears
like
because it's so thin. Yeah, exactly. So that is something to keep in mind, is that lower power requirements, right? Thinner form factor designs. The other thing I want you to keep in mind, and again, I don't know how in-depth they're going to get with monitor technologies, but let me kind of tell you that even within LEDs, they have a couple different types of backlighting technologies. It's still LED, right? But they have what is known as basically a white LED backlighting, and they have what's known as RGB LED backlighting, all right? White backlighting is kind of it's an interesting how it happens, right? It's actually a trick of the mind. And what I mean by that is white backlighting isn't white. It's actually blue, and there's yellow phosphorus colors in there, and the mixing of the two kind of fools your eye into believing what you see is actually white. Don't worry about that for the exam, but just kind of as a heads up there. Now, the other technology is exactly what it sounds like, right? Red, green, blue. Right? For every color, you have 3 little LEDs, red, green, and blue, right? And it forms what's known as an LED matrix, right? It's a big old... Think of the Matrix, right? If you go back to the movie and you see the little binary codes coming down and they cover the entire screen. That's essentially what we're talking about here. So do keep that in mind, that is some of the technologies when it comes to LCD and LED. But we're not out of the woods yet, unfortunately, right? We also have other technologies like OLED. Now, with OLED, it is a little bit different in the fact that the backlighting source is an organic substance, right? It's an organic substance that you can put electrical current to, and it produces a phosphorus glow. In fact, the military's kind of had this around for a very long time. I think I was doing some little research on it, right? And it goes back to like the late 50s. And very early on in the technology, not what we see today, but they could take like a citric acid, and they could apply an electrode to it, or an electrical current, and it would glow, right? I know we used to see this out there when I'd go fishing at night in certain areas. You've probably seen it where you see the fish, you're like, oh, wow, I can see the green fish there. And again, that's because of the high phosphorus content in the water. So the concept is the same. I want to kind of go along with what Dan said with LEDs being low powered. OLEDs are even lower than that. And that's why you find them, majority of those types of screens are really inside of things like your mobile devices, right? Because think about mobility, right? When it comes to mobility, there are two major things that we need to keep in mind. Battery life and thermal dynamics, right? Making sure that we don't overheat, keeping things cool. OLED screens can be very, very small form factor, can have a really, really small real estate, if you will, as far as the dimensions go, and produce an excellent quality type of output. So those are some that you have too. Now the other ones that they also talk about, they talk about two types. They talk about a plasma screen. Plasma screens, they are out there. They still sell them for sure, but there are some drawbacks to a plasma screen. One, power. They are very, very power hungry next to an LED screen. But they also have a very wide viewing angle. They don't have quite the reflections that like an LCD screen would. So there are benefits to them. The other one is what is known as a projector. And a projector is one that uses lenses, if you will, and usually red, green, blue, and it projects it against some kind of backdrop, right? That's really pretty much, I would say, for the exam, all you have to know about a project is when it comes to a projector, then knowing that it, that type. All right, moving down on our list, we got to talk about what's known as refresh rate, and we have to know what's called frame rate. And yes, they are different. When we talk about refresh rate, it's kind of interesting that the light sources that we see when we use artificial lighting isn't a static light source. They're actually turning on and off very, very fast. And refresh rate, if you will, is how fast does the screen get repainted, basically turning on and off. Refresh rate is measured in hertz. And one of the things you'll have to keep in mind is that typically 60 hertz and above really is what you'll see. And why is that? Well, a lot of times you can't even adjust refresh rates anymore. One of the great things, or one of the things to keep in mind about refresh rates is that anything lower than 60 hertz, the optical nerves within your eyes actually pick up on the fact that there's a flickering image, and it can give you headaches, right? We don't really modify these too much, Dan. I don't know if you remember the old CRTs. You definitely had to, because if you were staring at it too long, it could lead to things like headaches and stuff. Yeah. All right, so that is, and frame rate, right? We didn't talk about frame rate, right? So
you mentioned it.
I mentioned it. That's right. I went there. So refresh rate is a characteristic of the screen. Frame rate is a characteristic of how fast the video is moving. So there's two different, they're close, right? Frame rate is how fast can you get individual pictures into the monitor, where refresh rate is a characteristic of the monitor itself, and it could have an adverse effect on refresh rate, if that makes sense. So do please keep that in mind. What else do we have? We got to talk about things like resolution. That could
be important.
Resolution is important, right? Yeah. Resolution comes down to basically how many pixels does the surface area of the screen make up. In fact, I've got kind of a diagram here. You can kind of think of it this way, right? On your monitors, you have a horizontal axis, and you have an axis, if you will, and then you have a vertical axis, right? When you look at something like 920 by 1080, it literally means you can fit 1920 pixels in a single row, and 1080, if you will, in the vertical. So please keep that in mind, that resolution is the overall amount of pixels that the monitor supports. Now, one thing also to keep in mind when we talk about LCDs and LEDs, unlike the earlier CRT monitors, I do want you to keep in mind that you could adjust the resolution. All right, so you could potentially, on the old CRT monitors, you can get a better resolution because you can change it. LCDs and LEDs don't do that. They have what's known as a fixed resolution. On the exam, the objectives call out a native resolution. Native resolution is the one resolution that monitor was made to support. Now, understand, you can change the resolution. I'm not saying you can't change the resolution, but in changing the resolution, a lot of times what you see is you just kind of make icons bigger, they can get pixelated. Yeah. It never improves the quality of the image itself. So that is important. All right, now we get to two really confusing terms. One is subjective. Objective, I guess would be the opposite of that.
Yes, objective is the opposite of subjective.
Right. So they talk about brightness and lumens. All right. Brightness is kind of here we go with those number games, right? It's very bright. What does that mean? Right. Well, that's perception. Okay, brightness, if you will, is a subjective term that describes how bright the display is. The problem with it is brightness isn't measurable. There's no measurable unit that says I can measure the brightness, right? I can say right now to Dan and I, we've been standing in these studios for, Dan, you've been doing it for 2-3 years now, right? Mm-hmm. And to us, yeah, it's bright, but it's not that bad. However, we've had some people that come in and go, wow, that's kind of blinding bright. It's bright. It's a subjective term. We can't really measure it. That's where the other part of the measurable term comes in, and that's lumens. All right. So lumens is basically, if you will, is luminance, and it is the intensity of the light that's emitted on a surface per a unit area. Right. We can actually get a measurement in lumens. Luminance again can be measured, or luminance, if you will, can be measured in lumens. When we say you increase the lumens, again, you increase the brightness. Again, just remember, brightness, again, is just a subjective term. The higher, the amount of light output or the intensity of a light that's produced by the display itself. All right, Dan, moving down this list, let's see a couple of things that we also have to talk about. We have to talk about privacy and anti-glare filters. What are we talking about here? Now, we didn't say anything about the intrusion prevention system, right? But this is kind of like an intrusion, right? An intrusion prevention system, if you will. Anti-glare filters, yes, they do restrict the glare that you'll see sitting in front of the monitor, but they're also called privacy filters because one of the things that it does is as you move out of the direct front and center location of the monitor itself, you'll end up seeing that it darkens out. Right, so it keeps people, it doesn't keep people, it helps to reduce the risk of people doing things like shoulder surfing, seeing exactly what's going on your monitor, realizing that you're watching YouTube and not working. No, just kidding, guys.
Hated that thing.
That's right, that's right. We'll get one for Dan at the end of the day, so he'll be safe. And the other thing they also mention is multiple displays. This isn't, if you will, a characteristic of the monitor. I know they put it in display devices, Dan, but Dan, if I said I needed a multi-monitor output, what do you think would be the contributing factor to whether my computer supports multi-monitor or not?
The contributing factor to it has multiple display ports?
That's one of them. It's the graphics card, right? So it's the graphics card that actually tells you whether you can support multiple monitors. Now, most graphics cards do today. You can even get hubs that allow. We actually use hubs here that split. Understand that even though they put this in the display devices, personally, I believe it really should be in the expansion cards that we've talked about.
So does the graphics card, because I've also seen and have worked with the like Y splitters that you put into one input. So if you have a graphics card, it's only got one output. You put that on, it's got a splitter, now you have two monitors. Does that dictate whether or not that works as well? Or
yeah, it really is. It's really characteristic of the graphics card. If it's an integrated graphics card, then it's a characteristic of the motherboard because it's the chipset that'll control the graphics in general. So yeah, but what it isn't a characteristic of is the monitor, right? If I have two 27-inch monitors side by side, they don't know each other exist, right? It's the graphics system, if you will, that's spreading that information coming out of the computer across those multiple monitors. All right, now the last thing that we have to talk about in this episode is what is known as aspect ratio. All right, now aspect ratio is really just a proportional relationship between an image width and its height. All right, and there are a few different ones that we do want to talk about. All right, one of the things that we want to talk about is the different aspect ratios for a long time, Dan. And I know you're into photography, so this one will get you. A long time, printed images, photography was in a 4.3 aspect ratio. That was actually a standard for it. a long time, really. And it's what our old CRT monitor supports. And let's go ahead and look at a little diagram so you guys can kind of get, when I say that proportional relationship, notice height a ratio to its, or its width to its height. I said height width, understand it's width to height. And you can see the difference between some of these different types, if you will, of aspect ratios. There is 4.3. It was common for a very, very long time. Now you'll see in your objectives, I'm going to do this in a little out of order just because of the history behind it. 16 by 10 was popular for a little bit, and one of the reasons the 16 by 10 was common is that TVs were made, or I'm sorry, 16 by 10 was popular in monitors, but it wasn't popular in TVs, is what I meant to say. And it fell kind of out of favor. And one of the reasons it kind of fell out of favor is because if you think about people like Samsung, if you think about people like LG, and I'm just thinking of some of the, you know, the monitor manufacturers out there, they would make, Samsung makes TVs and they make monitors, right? Well, it got really inconvenient for the manufacturers to make a 16 by 10 monitor versus a 16 by 9 TV. So 16 by 10 kind of fell out of favor, and it's really been replaced today. I say replaced, but more common to see 16 by 9. As 16 by 9, I want you to understand, allows the manufacturers to put the same technologies they have in TVs and monitors, right? I've actually hooked up my computer with an external adapter right to a 55-inch TV, and let me tell you, that's a big monitor for sure. So 16 by 9 is the common, you know, it's the international standard right now for high-definition TV, and it really was what has pretty much replaced all 4x3. Don't get me wrong, you still see 16 by 10, and where do you see it? Tablets. Tablets are still 16 by 10, but again, different monitor types. You see a 16 by 10 OLED tablet screen versus the more common 16 by 9. Now, there are all different kinds of resolutions out there that they support. I'm just going to mention them here briefly. In 16 by 10, some of the common ones you have is what's known as WXGA, that's Wide Extended Graphics Array, and that is a 1280 by 800. There's more, just to kind of give you an example here. It's also Wide Ultra Extended Graphics Array. Man, they're going to just put the alphabet in some of these, the whole alphabet. And that is your 1920 by 1200. Maybe you've seen that, heard about that. 16 by 9, we have anything from 1280 by 720 all the way up to, and this is interesting, Ultra 4K. When we talk about ultra full or full 4K, we're talking 4096 by 2304. And they even have things, and you don't have to worry about this one on the exam, but I definitely want one of these in my house. 8192 by 4608, and that is full 8K TV.
That's the numbers you multiply together to get the price of the television.
That's absolutely right. Or the years that it takes to pay it off, for sure.
Exactly.
So, guys, I know we threw a lot of specifications at you, but keep in mind, if you are aware of some of these specifications, you should do good when it comes to passing the exam. Now, there's one last thing that I kind of want to talk about when it comes to just video in general. In the past, with our earlier CRT monitors, and this is really talking about the communication ports that we use as well as the technology, is analog video and digital video. When we talk about analog video, it's really kind of outdated today. It's still there. We've talked about it in other episodes like video graphics array, but more common today that you see is at a minimum DVI, digital connections. We talked about this in some of our PC connection episodes. Things like HDMI, very, very prevalent, as well as DisplayPort, and even now, we've had for a while, I say now, Thunderbolt technology. So understand the difference between, the old analog, like a sine wave, if you will, versus a series of ones and zeros. And again, the difference between analog and digital. So just a few of the display technologies that you have to keep in mind, and if you can get some of these under your belt, you're going to be doing good when they ask you these questions on your exam. All
right, Wes, thanks so much for explaining the different types of displays that we might be working with and their characteristics, because we're going to need that, like you say, for that exam. That being said, I'm looking at our clock. We're well out of time. We do thank you guys for watching. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.